Ready to go back in time with me? We're diving deep into 1942, a year that really changed the whole landscape of World War II.
Mm.
And, the timeline you've given us is, wow, incredible. I think it's really going to help us sort of untangle everything that happened that year.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, really see how the war was won.
It's interesting. We talk about 1942 as a turning point in the war,
Right.
but it really started with a lot more Axis victories.
Yeah, it's true. The first few months were pretty grim for the Allies.
They were.
Manila Falls in January.
Hmm.
Not long after, Singapore, which was, it was supposed to be this unbreachable fortress.
Yeah.
It was like a symbol of British power in Asia.
Right.
And then February, it
Yeah.
falls to the Japanese too.
The fall of Singapore was really devastating for the British, and not just because they lost territory, was the
Oh,
psychological impact was huge,
yeah.
both at home and for the troops. Kind of shattered this idea that, Britain was unbeatable,
Right.
especially for their colonies. And in many ways, more than any other single event, this was the start of the end for the British Empire.
Wow. Yeah, and as if all that wasn't bad enough, in February, the Japanese bombed Darwin, Australia.
Right.
Shows just how far they could reach.
Yeah, it really showed how vulnerable Australia was. Suddenly the war felt much closer to home
Right.
for the Australians, so it really ramped up, the urgency of everything.
Yeah, definitely a wake-up call. It felt like the Allies were, I don't know, almost on the verge of collapse at that point.
Yeah.
But then finally some hope. The first sign that things were turning around in the Pacific, I think, was the Battle of the Coral Sea in May.
That's right. A lot of people remember the Battle of the Coral Sea as like a tie, tactically,
Right.
but it was a strategic win for the Allies.
It was.
It stopped the Japanese from getting to Port Moresby
Right.
in New Guinea. If
Yeah.
they'd gotten there, they would have had this base, to threaten Australia directly.
Right.
But maybe even more importantly, the Japanese lost an aircraft carrier in that fight.
Yeah.
A loss they really couldn't afford.
And that loss really had a big impact just a month later at Midway, right?
Absolutely.
That missing carrier could have made a huge difference for the Japanese there.
Totally. The lack of that carrier definitely played a part in their loss at Midway. But before we get into that, we should probably talk about the Doolittle Raid,
Oh, yeah.
which happened in April, just a month before the Battle of the Coral Sea.
The Doolittle Raid. What a bold move. American bombers
Yeah.
taking off from an aircraft carrier to attack Tokyo itself.
Right.
Talk about capturing the world's imagination.
Oh, absolutely. In terms of physical damage, the raid didn't do that much.
Right.
But the psychological impact was huge. It was like a shot in the arm for American morale. It showed that Japan wasn't invincible after all.
Yeah.
And it forced the Japanese to pull resources back to defend their homeland, which meant they had less to use on offense elsewhere.
So it really changed the whole narrative of the war.
It did.
And then June, the Battle of Midway. Probably the most important naval battle in history, I think.
It's up there.
It really changed the whole course of the war in the Pacific.
It did. Midway was a decisive win for the Allies. The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The U.S. only lost 1. It really crippled the Japanese fleet
Wow.
and really limited their ability to stay on the offensive.
Yeah. I always think about Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best. One well-placed bomb from his Dauntless dive bomber took out the Akagi, the flagship of the whole Japanese fleet.
Right.
Talk about precision and courage. Those pilots were incredible.
Yeah, they really were. A lot of people see Midway as the turning point in the Pacific. It was the beginning of the end for Japanese naval dominance. They had to switch to a defensive strategy for the rest of the war. The fighting was still intense, of course, but Japan couldn't really dictate the terms of those engagements anymore.
Right, right. And while all this was happening in the Pacific, the Eastern Front was, well, it was its own beast.
Oh, yeah.
Brutal fighting, unique challenges.
Brutal is the right word. The siege of Leningrad had started back in 41, and it just kept going, just this stranglehold on the city. And battles were raging for control of key cities, resources, everything.
Right, right. We hear a lot about the German advance, but the Soviets weren't just sitting back.
Oh, no, not at all.
They launched that winter counteroffensive in December 41, pushed the Germans back from Moscow,
Yes.
inflicted heavy casualties. That was huge. It really shattered this idea that the Germans were unbeatable.
That's it.
Showed just how tough the Soviets were.
Yeah, that counteroffensive really showed what it meant to fight on the Eastern Front. The weather was like a weapon itself.
Yeah.
And the distances, the logistics, a nightmare for both sides.
Yeah.
But even with the Soviet successes, the fighting, it was just relentless.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the Battle of Kharkov, May 42, really shows that. A big defeat for the Soviets.
Yeah.
Shows how back and forth things were on the Eastern Front. And it really shows how brilliant some of the German commanders were.
It does.
Like Erich von Manstein.
Yeah, Kharkov was a big win for the Germans, but it also showed how obsessed Hitler was becoming with Stalingrad,
Right.
which, well, we know how that turns out.
Yeah. And meanwhile, in North Africa, there's Rommel, the Desert Fox,
Yeah.
always keeping the Allies guessing.
Yeah.
His counteroffensive at El Agheila in January really caught the British by surprise.
Rommel was a master of maneuver warfare. I mean, he could spot a weakness a mile away
Yeah.
and launch a counterattack before you could blink. Really tough opponent in the desert.
He was. But North Africa wasn't just about Rommel's tactics, right?
No, you're right. Control of the Mediterranean was crucial.
Yeah.
And that little island of Malta, right in the middle of it all, became really important
Yeah.
strategically.
It was under constant attack. The Axis powers were desperate to knock it out.
It was a real thorn in their side.
Yeah,
Despite all the bombing, the struggle to get supplies, Malta held out.
it did.
Disrupted Axis shipping, provided a base for Allied operations.
And that's where Operation Bowery comes in, right?
Yeah.
May 42. The British, in this incredibly daring operation, deliver Spitfires to Malta.
Using the aircraft carrier USS Wasp.
I love Churchill's quote about it. Who says a wasp can't sting twice?
Yeah. Those Spitfires made a big difference in the air battle over Malta, helped secure the island's defense, and really paved the way for the battles of El Alamein later in the year.
Which were a turning point in North Africa.
They were.
But while all these battles were raging, something much darker was happening.
It was. While the world focused on the fighting, the Nazis were putting their plan for the final solution into action,
Right.
exterminating the Jewish people. It was formalized at the Wannsee Conference in January.
It's just chilling to think that while armies were fighting for land and resources, the Nazis were planning this systematic genocide.
It is. The Wannsee Conference was a major step up in the Nazi persecution of Jews.
Yeah. And it just got worse as the year went on. More and more restrictions. Jews were forced into ghettos. They had to wear the yellow star, making them targets.
Right.
I mean, it was happening right in front of the world. Though the full horror of it, well, that was still to come.
It was.
And even in the midst of all this darkness, there were incredible stories of courage and compassion.
There were.
Like Anton Schmid, a German soldier who was executed for saving Jews, risked everything to help those in need.
These stories are so important. They show us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can still resist.
Yeah. Schmid's story, and others like it, remind us that even when surrounded by hate and indifference, some people choose compassion. It's important to remember those stories.
Yeah,
They give us a bit of hope in the face of the Holocaust.
absolutely. These acts of defiance and courage show that even in a system of hate, individual choices matter.
They do. But sadly, for many, hope was fading. By June, the first reports started coming out about the use of gas to kill Jews being sent to the east, a chilling foreshadowing of the extermination camps.
They were often dismissed as rumors, propaganda, but they were the first whispers of the mass murder that was happening.
So the first half of 1942, it's this mix, a global conflict, early Axis victories, then the first hints of a shift in power, incredible swings in fortune, and unimaginable horrors.
Yeah.
But there's still more to the story of 1942.
There is.
In November, we have Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa.
A pivotal moment. American forces enter the European theater for the first time, a new phase of the war. But it also meant dealing with Vichy France, which was complicated.
Yeah, the Allies had to secure North Africa without pushing Vichy France closer to the Germans. Tricky situation.
Absolutely. It took military might and careful diplomacy. And while that was happening in North Africa, the Soviets were tightening the noose around the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad.
Stalingrad, a battle that would become synonymous with urban warfare and suffering. By November, the Sixth Army was surrounded, trapped in the city they'd tried to conquer. So as 1942 came to a close, things seemed to be turning in favor of the Allies.
They did.
Victories like Midway and El Alamein gave a glimmer of hope.
But the war was far from over. 1943 would bring even more intense fighting and more losses, and the full horror of the Holocaust was still to be revealed.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about how those Allied victories in 42 really started to turn the tide. But, they were hard won
Yeah.
and came at a huge cost. Let's look closer at some of those key battles, starting with Midway. What made that clash of carriers such a decisive turning point?
Well, at Midway, intelligence played a crucial role.
Sure.
American code breakers had cracked the Japanese naval code,
Oh, wow.
gave them a real advantage.
Yeah.
They knew Japan was planning a big Pacific offensive, and they were able to figure out the target, Midway Island. Admiral Nimitz used that intel to position his forces just right, basically set a trap for the Japanese fleet.
So it wasn't just about having more firepower, it was about knowing when and where to use it.
Exactly. Surprise was key. Japan thought they'd catch the Americans off guard, but they walked right into an ambush. And the Americans also had a technological edge. Their Dauntless dive bombers, those were designed specifically for carrier operations. They were incredibly effective against the Japanese ships. Better dive bombing capabilities, more powerful bombs.
So it sounds like the Dauntless was almost purpose-built for a battle like Midway. Anything else about those planes that made them so successful?
Oh, yeah. They were tough, reliable, could take a lot of damage and still make it back to the carrier. And the pilots were well-trained.
Right.
So you've got a durable plane, a skilled pilot, and a powerful bomb. That's a recipe for success. The Japanese planes, on the other hand, they were nimble, but more fragile. And they didn't have the same dive bombing power.
So a combination of good intelligence, strategy, and technology really swung things in the Allies' favor at Midway. Amazing how it all came together for such a decisive win. Now, shifting gears to North Africa, the battles of El Alamein. Why were those so important?
Well, El Alamein was kind of the culmination of a long, tough fight in North Africa. Rommel's Afrika Korps had been pushing east, posing a serious threat to the Suez Canal.
Right.
A vital supply route for the Allies. Losing the Suez would have been a catastrophe.
Yeah.
It would cut supply lines, maybe even let the Axis link up with forces in the Middle East.
Wow. So the stakes at El Alamein were incredibly high. What were some of the strategic decisions that led to the Allied victory there?
Well, the British, under General Bernard Montgomery, they were very methodical in their planning and preparation. Montgomery knew logistics were key. He made sure his forces were well supplied, had more troops and equipment. He also knew he had to counter Rommel's tactical brilliance, so he came up with a plan that combined deception, overwhelming firepower, and just relentless attacks on the German lines.
So it seems like Montgomery was a very strategic leader, almost the opposite of Rommel's more, improvisational style.
Yeah, you could say that. Montgomery was a planner, very deliberate. He believed in overwhelming the enemy with numbers and firepower rather than risky maneuvers. Some people criticized his approach, but it worked against Rommel.
So a real clash of styles then, as well as armies. And in the end, Montgomery's planning and the sheer determination of his troops won out. Any particular tactics used at El Alamein that stand out to you?
Well, one thing that was really effective was the use of massive artillery barrages.
Okay.
They'd pound the German defenses before sending in the infantry. The British had way more artillery, and they used it to devastating effect. Hours and hours of bombardment before the troops went in.
I can only imagine what that must have been like for the soldiers on both sides.
Hmm.
The scale of those bombardments was unlike anything seen in desert warfare before.
Absolutely. The sheer volume of firepower was incredible. This deafening roar across the desert, the ground shaking from the impact of the shells. It was terrifying.
We talked about how important intelligence was at Midway, and it seems deception also played a role at El Alamein.
It did. Montgomery used all sorts of tricks to mislead Rommel about where and when the main British attack would come. They made fake tanks, fake artillery positions in the south. Rommel thought that's where the main assault would be, so he concentrated his forces there. But the real attack came in the north, and it caught him off guard.
Wow. It's amazing how cunning and strategy can be just as important as brute force. It seems like those factors, intelligence, deception, and firepower, were key to the Allied victories at both Midway and El Alamein. Now let's turn to the Eastern Front, to the brutal struggle for Stalingrad.
Right, Stalingrad. Now that was a battle of attrition, a brutal urban meat grinder. It just chewed up both the German and Soviet armies.
Yeah.
Months of fighting, street by street, building by building, neither side willing to give an inch.
What were conditions like for the soldiers fighting in Stalingrad? It's hard to even imagine the intensity and desperation in that ruined city.
It was hell on earth, truly. The city was rubble from the constant bombing and shelling. Streets choked with debris, the air thick with smoke and, well, the stench of death. Snipers everywhere picking off soldiers from hiding. Close quarters combat was brutal. Hand-to-hand fighting was common.
It sounds like a nightmare. Was there any respite for those soldiers at all?
Very little. Both sides fought with incredible ferocity, driven by ideology, patriotism, a will to survive, and the winter weather just made everything worse. Temperatures way below freezing, frostbite and disease were rampant.
Right.
A lot of soldiers died from the cold as much as from enemy fire.
It was during this battle that Hitler issued his infamous no retreat order. Basically, he condemned his own troops to a fight they couldn't win.
He did, and that refusal to allow a retreat sealed the fate of the German Sixth Army. They were trapped, surrounded by the Soviets, slowly starved and frozen into submission. A catastrophic defeat for the Germans, a major turning point on the Eastern Front.
It's unbelievable how one decision, driven by pride and a refusal to see reality, can have such disastrous consequences. And while the German Sixth Army was being destroyed at Stalingrad, Rommel was facing his own setbacks in North Africa, right? It seems like the Axis was starting to crumble on multiple fronts.
Yes, definitely. Those defeats at Stalingrad and El Alamein, happening almost at the same time, they were huge blows to the Axis. They really marked a shift in the balance of power. The tide was turning, and it would eventually lead to the Allied victory.
And as all this was happening, the truth about the Holocaust was starting to come out. What were some of the key developments in the Nazi persecution of the Jews in the second half of 42?
Well, the second half of 42 saw a massive escalation of the Holocaust.
Right.
The extermination camps, which were originally meant for political prisoners and other undesirables, they became the main tools of the final solution. Deportations from the ghettos to these camps increased drastically, and the systematic murder of Jews using gas chambers became a horrific reality.
It's horrifying to think about the sheer scale of the genocide that was being carried out. Can you tell us more about the conditions in those extermination camps?
The conditions were beyond inhumane. People were crammed into cattle cars, transported for days with no food or water. When they arrived, they were subjected to these brutal selections. Some were deemed fit for slave labor. The rest were sent straight to the gas chambers.
It's almost impossible to grasp the level of cruelty and dehumanization inflicted on those innocent people.
The Nazis designed these camps to be efficient killing factories. They used deception, telling people they were going to showers to lure them into the gas chambers. The bodies were then dumped in mass graves or burned in crematoria.
This is just a horrific example of human depravity, a warning about unchecked ideology.
The Holocaust stands as the stark warning against intolerance, hatred, dehumanization. It's a reminder that we have to be constantly vigilant in protecting human rights and fighting prejudice in all its forms.
It's a lesson we can never forget.
Yeah.
So as we come to the end of 1942, the world was facing all these interconnected events. Military victories, shifts in power, and the horrific truth of the Holocaust.
1942 was pivotal, a year of huge change and upheaval. It really set the stage for how World War II would eventually end.
You know, it's fascinating how all these events in 42, the Pacific battles, the North African campaign, the Holocaust, that clash at Stalingrad, how it's all connected, really shaped the direction of the whole war.
Absolutely. It really shows you just how global World War II was.
Right.
It wasn't just a bunch of separate battles happening. What happened on one continent directly affected what was going on somewhere else.
Yeah.
Take El Alamein. Once the Allies won in North Africa, they could send those troops and resources somewhere else, like to Italy, for the invasion they were planning.
Right. So those victories had these ripple effects beyond just the immediate battlefields.
Yeah.
So talking about effects, how did that big shift after Midway change things in the Pacific?
Midway was definitely a turning point. After that loss, Japan had to go on the defensive in the Pacific. And the Allies, well, they had the advantage now, so they started their island hopping campaign, pushing the Japanese back island by island towards their homeland.
Right. In that island hopping campaign, I mean, some of the most brutal fighting of the whole war took place there. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island fiercely defended, huge casualties on both sides.
Yeah.
What made those battles so tough for the Allies?
Well, the Japanese had a very different way of fighting. They dug in deep on those islands, often choosing to fight to the death rather than surrender. And they used the terrain to their advantage, built these elaborate tunnels and bunkers, made it really difficult to dislodge them.
Yeah, it sounds like the fighting was just savage.
It was. Those Pacific Island battles were brutal, some of the costliest of the war. The Japanese soldiers, they had this Bushido code, this warrior code, emphasized honor, self-sacrifice.
Right.
They fought with incredible tenacity, suicidal charges, fighting to the last man.
Yeah. And what about the Eastern Front? After Stalingrad, did the Soviets keep pushing west?
They did. Stalingrad was a huge turning point there, too. It broke that myth of German invincibility, marked the start of their long retreat. The Soviets wanted revenge, they wanted to liberate their land, so they launched offensive after offensive, driving the Germans back towards Berlin.
It sounds like the tide had definitely turned in favor of the Allies by the end of 42. But as you said earlier, the war wasn't over yet. 43 and beyond had plenty more challenges, more battles, more sacrifices in store.
Absolutely. 42 was a turning point, but there was still a long way to go. The Allies were still facing a very tough enemy. And even with the military successes, the world was just beginning to understand the true horror of the Holocaust, a crime that would forever stain humanity.
Yeah. A reminder that even in the midst of triumph, there are still shadows. And the true cost of war goes far beyond the battlefields.
Exactly. World War II was a global tragedy. Millions dead, cities destroyed. The world was changed forever.
So after this deep dive into 1942, what can we take away? What are the lasting lessons from this year?
I think 1942 shows us just how complex war is, how events that seem unconnected are actually intertwined, and how the decisions made during conflict have such a lasting impact. It shows the importance of intelligence, strategy, technology, and of course the human factor, the courage, the resilience, the sacrifices of those who fought and those who suffered.
Yeah, it reminds us that history isn't just dates and battles. It's about individual stories, acts of bravery, moments of terrible darkness. It's our responsibility to learn from it all, to honor those sacrifices, and try to build a world where those horrors never happen again.
I think that's a good place to leave it. As we move forward, remembering the lessons of 1942 is crucial. Those lessons can help us face the challenges of our own time. Understanding the past can help us build a better, more peaceful future.
Absolutely. And for those who want to learn more about this pivotal year, I encourage you to dig deeper into the many historical resources out there. Personal accounts, diaries, in-depth analyses of military strategy, political decisions. There's so much more to discover about this incredible and complex period in history.